So good evening, London. Thanks very much for having me along. I appreciate that UKRI and Digital Catapult have included us this evening. What an act to follow, right? Bruce Perens, the godfather of open source. So I have the death slot in that I'm following Bruce. We're way behind time, and I'm supposed to do this in 15 minutes. So I'm going to do three things. I'm going to speak super fast. If it becomes too fast, wave your hand in the air, and I will know you want me to slow down. I'm going to counter what Jeff said about Betteridge's law. If I was writing this, it would not say, is the future for secure computing systems open source? It would say, open source is the future of our infrastructure. How do we make it secure? And I think we're asking entirely the wrong question by putting it that way around. And that's what I hope to show you this evening. And then the third thing I'm going to do is I'm going to be quite strategic, but I'm also going to drill back down on one or two very practical base points that I think Bruce picked up on, but maybe didn't give you some of the details because he had so much to share with you. So how did I get into open source? Beginning of 2008, I joined a company called Canonical. Some of you might know them. They were then the commercial sponsor of the Ubuntu operating system. They do much more today. I joined them as the general counsel, the head lawyer. I set up the legal team, and I ran that for 5 years. I came in as a company commercial lawyer with a really strong background in tech and no knowledge of open source. And something weird happened, which was that I fell in love with open source. And from that point on, my career has sort of focused around that. So even when I've worked in other spaces, I've stayed involved in things like this UN group, where I have contributed back to the communities through the legal and governance space. So I've been involved in legal and governance and open source for the last 15 years. And this particular group that I chaired was for the UN. It becomes relevant later, and it was the UN's Technology Innovation Lab's Open Source and IP Advisory Group. I provide my time free of charge to a number of different advisory groups, and you can see more of those on LinkedIn if you want to follow me or see more about what I actually do. But I think the one that I want to pause and talk about is the Open Source Initiative. Obviously, Bruce founded it. The Open Source Initiative is the organization that is the custodian of the open source definition, and it's the organization that approves licenses as being open source. And it's either open source or it's proprietary. As Bruce correctly pointed out, disclosed software is not open source. And it's not open source because it doesn't meet the open source definition and it doesn't get shared on an OSI-approved license. Now, you'll see as I talk about some of the challenges, Bruce did not come down from a mountain. And I've said this for years, and this time he's going to tell me I'm right. You did not come down from a mountain with a tablet of stone with the 10 open source definitions carved out on it, right? You brought those.
I did that when I was Moses.
Right, okay, let's not go there. Come on, my turn. So he didn't come down with this tablet of stone. And it's something that we have to keep in our heads, that this is something man-made that we may want to reconstruct over time. But any change to it would have a massive impact because of the millions and billions of uses of open source software globally. So I'm going to work on the premise that the open source definition is correct. The open source definition is what makes open source. And it's when you share code which is available publicly, as Bruce said, was the case also with disclosed code, but also when you have an OSI-approved license. And that's the key part. And we'll come back to that in just a moment. So I have a book coming out. This will be the only time you will ever see my name on the front of a book that I have edited. Had lockdown not happened, this would never have got to publication. There are 22 authors and 24 chapters. They're world leaders. Writing is one thing. Editing other people's work is one of the worst things you could ever do, so don't do it. This book will be extremely expensive and published by Oxford University Press. It will be very weighty and thick. The good thing is that the Veitch Foundation have given the funds for it to be open access. So it will be available to students, to communities, to anybody who wants to use the content. My chapter is on economics of open source, business models, and revenue generation. And I also do a lot of this. Pre-lockdown, I used to travel. I've just started doing it again. It's so much harder than it used to be, and I don't know why. But for the last 2 years, I've sat at home giving talks about open source. So what is this open source of which she speaks, and why does it matter? I've already said to you, open source software is software where the source code, the human readable piece, is publicly available, and it has an OSI-approved license. Now, that's the kind of lawyer's definition I would write down in my career as a lawyer. If you use open source for economic reasons, and it breaks my heart, but most people do, this will not achieve your goals. This will achieve what you need in a contract, and that's it. If you want to create open source to avoid lock-in, if you want to create open source so that you can recycle and reuse code in your organization or elsewhere, following that definition is a highway to nothing. The definition is correct, but what goes with it is all the good practices that Bruce alluded to. So you need to be able to build code that can be maintained, that can be collaborated on, that can be contributed to, that has documentation, that's otherwise made secure, has all the good governance and the good housekeeping that the open source communities, and in particular the legal and governance communities around open source, have been doing for the last decade. And those tools are there for the taking. It's just getting this message out and sharing what they are with folks like yourself isn't always easy. So open source matters because it has a value. Now, Bruce has talked about economics, and that's something that we've really looked at Open UK. Last year, we published our first suite of reports. They are, I'm told, excellent, right? I'm going to take that because we've got a new one coming out next week, and I don't know what it is that made them excellent, so I don't know if I've got the magic formula again or not. But they will explain open source to you. They focus on the UK, and they will give you real-life examples. openuk.uk/open. No, it's not. openuk.uk/state-of-open. So you'll see these 9 stats. And if you look at the top left, the 43.15 billion. If you take Tech Nation's definition of the UK's digital economy, that is 20% of the UK's digital economy. And that is based on out-of-date figures. It's based on a calculation that focuses on total cost of ownership, which is a decade old and entirely the wrong thing for us to be looking at. But it's what we look at because we don't understand yet how to measure value generated, which is where we need to go. And it's what Bruce was talking about when he's looking at the barter type values and the contribution. So what we've done historically is calculate based on number of developers, numbers of lines of code contributed. But that doesn't show you how, open source sitting under a cloud provider generates value to the economy. We're working with a number of companies, and if any of you know more, we're happy to work with them on getting that kind of data. We know we will have it by next year. We have a figure for the first 6 months of this year, looking at the number of downloads of open source in the UK. So we need to evolve this. We need to move away from that kind of thinking. And you'll see that across the reports. Funnily enough, Bruce mentioned space, of course, Ingenuity, the little helicopter that was on Mars, that started as an open source project. Bet you didn't know the UK was the 5th biggest contributor anywhere in the world to that project. So we were part of NASA's, what started as a science project, and during the process of the landing on Mars became part of the actual mission because it was so successful. And it's got a little bit of UK contribution in there. So we look at the economics because we have to. What I would really like to look at is the societal value. And the societal value of open source is huge. Last year, we held our first Open Technology for Sustainability Day at COP26, super well received. A number of other organizations like KDE and the Cloud Native Foundation have now built sustainability projects, sort of following that influence from us in the UK. And what we delivered last year was an event bringing together lots of world leaders, recognizing some of the UK's folks. So Francis Maud, Lord Maud, is a big supporter of ours. He keynoted that conference for us and talked about GDS and where the UK was going and where it's going for the future. Absolutely brilliant talk. It's available on our website. This year, we're taking it a step further. So last year, we delivered the conference and we delivered a blueprint for the data center of the future using open source software, hardware, data. That's now sitting in the Eclipse Foundation, and we're taking the model of the blueprint and redoing it this year for EV charging. Our second Open Technology for Sustainability Day will be on the 16th of November in Edinburgh, and we'll share that then. But we will also share societal value metrics. Now, this will be V1.0, but it will measure all of the good stuff, all of the value of collaboration, of skills development, of contribution that we get from open source that we don't see in the straight economics. So I've asked you, why does open source matter? And when I was in Canonical, I became a parrot, right? It was really hard. I was the head lawyer, so every other commercial lawyer's deals came up to me, every commercial team's deals came up to me as the point of escalation. And I would repeat the same conversations again and again and again for 5 years, which got pretty tough. And I'd be explaining risk, because that's what lawyers do. And I'd be explaining risk to people in procurement teams, people in legal departments, finance people, who didn't really understand open source at all. And it took months, and they blocked us, and it stopped the adoption of open source. So I will put my hand up to say that lawyers are partly to blame for that. Something has changed in the last decade, and I think it's 3 things. I might be wrong, and I'm really happy to discuss this more, but I think it's 3 things. Our world has digitalized, and as it's digitalized, it's become software-defined. And in being software-defined, what that means is the status of the hacker, the status of the developer has risen. They are now your top dogs in your organization. Where before it would be the IT or the IS systems in the corner, these people make essential decisions about your infrastructure and about where your organization, private or public sector, is going. And that elevated status has coincided with Git. Now, Git's a tool. I was at an event with Linus Torvalds last week, and he said he didn't create it. I always say he did. So I can't remember the other chap's name, and I haven't updated my memory. It's not my slides, my memory with his name, which I need to do. So Linus created this with his colleague in 2009. It's been adopted across GitLab, GitHub, all sorts of public repos to allow distributed working. And that's fabulous. But what it's also done is it's allowed collaborative working, and it's allowed open source to be put on GitHub, GitLab, etc., and taken into organizations without going through legal, procurement, or finance. Absolutely free. You go, you take the code, you bring it to your organization, you kick the tires, and you are a user before you contract. Now, if you're a smart organization from a compliance perspective, you'll realize your point of risk has moved. You're moving from contract and the gatekeeper being there to the developers. And what you need is policies and processes that work for open source. Most companies are starting this, but don't really have what they need. And that goes back to what I was saying about the adoption to avoid lock-in, the adoption to allow economic value to be created through reuse and recycle. If you don't think big picture and manage that to create good open source with those policies and procedures, you're not going to get anywhere. So now what we see is that the contract people only get involved when you get to the stage of open source coming into your enterprise, being used in your enterprise, and needing some support, needing something that's custom built for it. Whatever it is, you're going to be contracting with a company on one of up to 8 different business models because they're very limited. Making money out of something you've given away isn't the easiest thing to do. So you've got digitalization and the rise of the developer, GitHub and the ability to just take code, and the third thing is cloud computing. And this is an out-of-date picture, and you'll get it on the Cloud Native Foundation site. It is a map of all the packages distributed as part of Cloud Native. You can see for yourself the contribution and the valuation that's been given to that, billions and trillions. But also, you can see the inevitability of open source in our infrastructure in a platform economy. Fangirl photo with Linus, not up to date. I do have to get a new one for this year. This is pre-pandemic. Of course, I would be telling you that open source is super important and it's the future of our national critical infrastructure and business infrastructure, wouldn't I? So would he. Let's talk to somebody who, when I first started in open source at Canonical, Bug Zero was the destruction of Microsoft. Every joke about open source, the punchline was Microsoft, so I no longer know any jokes. And the reason I no longer know jokes is that in the last decade, we've seen a shift. And this shift that we've seen with Microsoft and others is something we're going to see with every one of your organizations. If you're not a happy open source consumer, contributor, or distributor, you are going to be. The reason they explain this journey from Steve Ballmer, the then CEO, saying that open source was a cancer, to 2018, Microsoft being the biggest contributor in the world by lines of code to open source, 3 reasons. This is my mate, Steve Wally, who's in the open source team at Microsoft. And he presented at the Linux Foundation Open Source Summit Europe in 2018 as the keynote. And his keynote has this picture of Satya Nadella asking for forgiveness. And he's asking to be judged on the recent past and the future. And he's asking for us to forget what happened with Ballmer in the old days, because open source is an inevitability. And it's an inevitability, Steve says, for 3 reasons. The first is that customers now ask for this. This is not benevolence. This is economic sense. This is shareholder value. If you want to provide software today, you have to provide open source. Secondly, developers who've grown up since the Linux kernel, which is 30 years old, whether they are people who've gone back to train again or who've learned to code in that time period, they use open source. Open source is many things to many people. It is not a business model, but it is a distribution methodology. It's a coding methodology. So if you want to engage those developers in a market that is now super, super competitive, because remember, everything is digitalized, then what you need to do is use open source. And the third thing is cloud. And Steve describes it as this little product they've got called Azure. You cannot do cloud without open source. And you can sit on top of it and you can consume it, but unless you're part of communities, you cannot contribute back. And if you can't contribute back, you can't influence and shape. So you have to be at that table if you want to influence feature development, that kind of thing. So moving on, but staying on this topic of cloud, we had some real issues not on disclosed software. I want to clarify this. So Bruce is talking about software that's acknowledged not to be open source and is proprietary and is disclosed. There is a couple of other terms often used for similar things, public source and shared source. Those are not open source either. They're proprietary code, but disingenuously, good lawyer word, disingenuously, they're often portrayed as being open source. And we actually made the New York Times with open source in 2019, where 7 open source CEOs got together and escalated this issue called strip mining. Strip mining, US term, New York State, applies to overusing the land to take away coal from the 70s. The allegation was that this was happening in open source software. But of course, once you share your code open source, you cannot take it back. You can shift, we call it lift and shift. You can shift, as the founder at Elastic did, as MongoDB have done, you can shift to being proprietary. But the problem the open source community has with that is when you dress it up as still being open when it's not. And we saw Shay Bannon, the founder of Elastic, describing doubling down on open, when in fact he means leaving open behind and going off and doing something proprietary, which caused a bit of confusion. Now, in open source, we like to call it FUD. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And that FUD started off a decade plus ago with Microsoft. They ended up in massive antitrust and competition disputes across Europe. And it's something that is still pervasive today, but it is pervasive today in a way that's impacting everyone in this room because it's affecting our critical national infrastructure. We need a clear and concise understanding of what open source is and how it's useful to our society. What we don't need is people confusing. And that confusion doesn't just happen in this commercial environment. We're seeing it in the standard space, but generated for the same reason, revenue. Nobody likes their market being disrupted, right? You can't blame them. It's ticking along nicely. They've got their revenue coming in. What you then see happen is, in this case with the standards bodies, telcos and chip companies unhappy that they're losing their standard essential patent royalties because standard essential patents for and licensing cannot work with open source licensing, and they don't want to shift. So in a collaborative way, we're actively engaging with those companies and trying to persuade them to come to the table and look at a way to carve out open source. But of course, they still have the revenue concerns. And one of those key concerns is that so much of the code today is open source that matters that if they were to carve open source out of it, they'd lose their revenue streams. Think about the sectors like mobile. They've already lost their roaming fees. They've lost the OTTs, the WhatsApp and the like, taking away their data revenue. But it's not just revenue that causes some of these issues. The open source definition has principles, and the principles are things like non-discrimination across field of use. So you cannot say you can use my code unless it's for commercial usage. That exists in Creative Commons. It does not exist in open source software licensing, and that causes huge confusion. So if you want to say that, accept that you're not doing open source, you're doing proprietary code, which is totally fine, just don't call it open source. But it also goes into society, and we also don't discriminate against people. You'll recognize the Ukraine flag. If you didn't know it before the start of this year, you can't have avoided it. And this was back in March when 8 young developers from Ukraine hosted one of the most heartbreaking things I've ever been on, a call with about 800 people on Twitter. And they talked about how they'd put down their keyboards and picked up their weapons. Awful, really awful. And I had friends amongst them. And then they asked me if I would help them. And I did, and I set up an open source contribution to the Red Cross and raised some money for it. But what I didn't do was participate in what they wanted, which was protestware, which is software that restricts software, techniques which restricts open source software going into Russia. And I couldn't be part of it because we don't restrict amongst people. Now, there are other things you can do in the distribution chain that don't affect the licensing, but you cannot choose not to give it to somebody. The whole point of it is that we're for everybody and we're about collaboration. And of course, security. You're wondering if I was ever going to get to it. So last year, President Biden, I think a year and 10 days ago, issued this ordinance from the White House. This is one of the smartest things I've ever read about open source. Ostensibly, it is about software and not specific to open source, but the people who have read and inputted into this understand open source super well. And what they focus on is the supply chain. What they focus on is software bill of materials, SBOMs. About 10, 12 years ago, I was in a bar in Boston, and late at night, a couple of guys from Motorola came up with a concept, and it's called SPDX. Don't ask me what it stands for. But SPDX is that supply chain SBOM management, and as of 2020, I think, it became an ISO-approved standard. These are not new issues. They're not issues we haven't thought about. The tools are there. We just need to share them with you. And Open UK was the only non-US organization to respond because we understand the importance of the critical infrastructure, the digitalized national critical infrastructure, and the place of security in that. But it's not a software, as I've said already, it's not an open source issue, it's a software issue. And when we look at open source, the issues are different from proprietary code. And as Bruce said, it's about funding. And we see the OpenSSF, which is a subset of the Linux Foundation. The OpenSSF has been in conversation with the White House. They've got a 10-point action list. I know you're all getting tired. I'm going to be quick. And what we're doing at Open UK for the UK is we are launching today, thanks to my invitation to this, and I'm grateful to both UKRI and the Catapults for inviting me, and this launch is absolutely distinct from what they're doing. We're launching the Summer of Open Source Security. And we're going to have, after the event today, we're going to have 4 events. We have the lady who runs SPDX will be speaking on the 6th of July. We'll have a session every week for 4 weeks after that. So if you want to know about supply chain standards, bill of security, all of that stuff, Kate's the woman. Nicholas Charlin, who is from the Department of Defense, he's now at the Air Force, has implemented DevSecOps out there. I guess that's probably one of the highest risks, so let's hear from somebody that's done it. And then Brian, whose surname I cannot pronounce for the life of me, Brian Bendelhorf, or something like that. Thank you, I can't do it, I've tried. It's probably because I'm Scottish. Brian is going to talk to us about the work they've done with the White House. And of course, we want to do the same stuff here. We have Andrew Martin, who's our CISO. He's also the founder of one of the, I guess, the best open source security companies in the world, but certainly in the UK. Andrew is going to moderate a panel with some of our advisory board, and then there'll be a series of podcasts and blogs across London, across the UK, actually. And in fact, you can take them anywhere in the world. I'm getting tired too. The kick-off event for our interaction with the public sector will be on the 20th of September, because all the folks who are dealing with this around the world will have come to Ireland for the Open Source Summit in Europe the week before. And we're hoping to engage with UK and devolved governments, with the public sector and the private sector. Now again, why do I care? I care because this national critical infrastructure. What do I mean by that? Well, you probably will recognise this as the Scottish variant. The only difference really between that and Omicron is you can hear it coming. But what happened during the pandemic was that we saw apps being built across the globe that were open sourced. Now, I'm not for a minute going to suggest that open source is the solution to all our problems, or that software is, or that technology is, but it's a tool. And we have shifted from a world of bricks and mortar to a world that's digitalized. Apps like this are part of it, but what's more important even is our national infrastructure. So the Energy Digitalisation Task Force, some things are hard to say fast, reported to the Energy Minister in January, And as well as talking about open data as they had in their first report, this time they also asked for a spine to be built for the UK on open source software. And that spine is something that, if it's built, will be replicated by other utilities. Now, what we have to think about is, how do we do that well? How do we do it in a good way from an open source perspective? And how do we do it in a way where it will be maintained and secure? And will be dependent on a world of software. So Kate Raworth, who many of you will know from Donut Economics, talks about shifting from the commons to looking at digital public good. And what I would like to see is us not recategorizing open or open source software specifically, but looking at how we can do both and ensure that we have that digital public good status. And that means that we have to collaborate. My last conference before lockdown was FOSDEM, Free and Open Source Developers Conference Europe. If there's one event that you go to in a year, if you're interested in open source, go to Brussels. First Sunday in February, be there the day before, even be there Friday. This is the Friday night. Usually we have beer. We didn't have beer. We went to the commission. Oh, we did have beer, actually. And then we went to the commission. And we went to the commission at midnight, and we watched as Brexit happened. And we watched how people react, because open source is about global collaboration, and that global collaboration is at the essence of everything we do. So Brexit or not, we have to be part of it. I'm going to take my final minute to tell you what I would normally have introduced at the beginning, Open UK. Open UK is the industry organisation for the business of open source in the UK. Anybody can participate. We are focused on people who work in open source. And as I've said to you already, any of you who have a company that has software in it, you use open source, and you're welcome to come along for the ride. We focus on UK leadership and global collaboration, and we do that with a very diverse community and a very heartfelt sense of belonging. We have a couple of paid employees, and then we have this leadership team, which is stupendous and world-class, and who are all pro bono. We build a cohesive community from that leadership community, and they bring their communities with them. We do events like awards. We influence legal and policy to make sure that the UK is a great place for open. Something I haven't said to you is, when we were doing our stats on State of Open last year, we talked to the folk doing the report for the Commission. They would not publish this, and I couldn't get permission to put it in writing. I'm not under NDA. Take of it what you will. There were 490,000 developers in Europe pre-Brexit in their calculations. Post-Brexit, they changed that to 260,000. Almost half of Europe's open source software developers are in the UK. Now, I suspect that figure will have gone down slightly with Brexit and back up again, because we have so many international participants in our communities. And I think they probably come here because English is the first language, and you get picked up by international companies. So we're for everybody. Wherever your company's head office, whatever you do around open, we're for you. We have massive impact on the legal and policy side, and we also are building learning. We've done 2 courses, Key Stage 3 for 11 to 15-year-olds. I think this is about to be rolled out in the US, fingers crossed. Next year, we will be doing one for 8 to 11-year-olds, and we have worked with Imogen Heap, the singer, on a digital glove. We're also building a MOOC, a massive open online course with one of the Scottish universities. And just to give you a sense, this is the impact we have with 2 employees and that community of about 150 leaders. And we can do that because these people are influencers, and they're influencers because they're world-class tech leaders. So to make 2022 the year of the open source tiger, I'm going to ask for all of your help, because you're from worlds that are different than mine, and we'd really like to collaborate with you. And I'm sorry, I think I'm over time too.